The first thing I noticed was the cold. Not the cold of winter, not the cold of a drafty room, the cold of a stranger's hands, trembling as they held me. The cold of a woman who was about to do something terrible and couldn't quite bring herself to finish it. I was a baby. I knew that. I could feel the softness of my own skin, the weakness of my limbs, the way my eyes couldn't quite focus on anything farther than a few inches away. But I also knew things I shouldn't know. Things that would take years to make sense of. I knew my name was supposed to be Iris Sterling. I knew I had just been swapped with another baby. And I knew, with a certainty that made my tiny heart pound, that the woman holding me was trying to decide if she should kill me. Her fingers tightened around my throat. Not enough to hurt, not yet, but enough to make me aware of the possibility. I stared up at her with my blurry newborn eyes, and I did the only thing I could think of. I smiled. It was a tiny movement, barely a twitch of my lips. But it was enough. Her hands loosened. Her breath caught. And then she was crying, tears dripping onto my face, salty and hot and desperate. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." She didn't kill me. She wrapped me in a thin blanket, nothing like the soft, warm one I'd been dressed in moments before, and carried me out into the rain. Behind us, the big house stood tall and bright, warm lights glowing in every window. The Sterling mansion. The place where I should have grown up. The place where Lily, my replacement, the baby Brenda had just swapped me for, would now live. Brenda clutched me to her chest and walked through the mud, her feet slipping on the wet ground. She was taking me to a different house. A smaller one. A poorer one. A place where I would grow up as Tuesday, the unwanted daughter who had no idea she'd been stolen. She thought she was saving her daughter. She thought she was giving Lily a better life. She had no idea what was coming. I knew what was coming. I'd lived it once already. In my first life, I'd grown up as Tuesday in a tiny Appalachian town. I'd been the favorite of my Grandma Rose, the only person in the house who treated me like I mattered. I'd lived through the years when the Sterlings fell from grace, when their money meant nothing, when their name was poison, when capitalist was a curse word and working class was the safest thing you could be. I'd watched Lily, the girl who'd taken my place, grow up privileged and spoiled, only to lose everything when the political winds shifted. She'd survived by being the most ruthless person in the room, turning on her own family when it suited her. And then, when the Sterlings recovered, when they came back to reclaim their place in society, I'd been the one they wanted back. Not because they loved me, because they felt guilty. Because I was a loose end they needed to tie up. They'd used me. Discarded me. And in the end, they'd let me burn. I remembered the fire. The heat. The smoke filling my lungs. I remembered my brother Ethan running away with Lily in his arms, leaving me to die. And I remembered thinking, this time, I'll do it differently. Now I was back. Back at the very beginning. Back in the arms of the woman who'd stolen my future. And I was going to make sure I didn't lose it again. Grandma Rose found me 3 days later. I was lying in a basket in the corner of Brenda's tiny cabin, wrapped in a dirty blanket, hungry and cold. Brenda had been ignoring me. She was too busy mourning the daughter she'd given away, too busy dreaming about the life Lily would have in the big house. But Grandma Rose wasn't like Brenda. She was old, wiry, and tough as shoe leather. She took one look at me and scooped me up in her arms. "Who's this little one?" she demanded, her eyes sharp as flint. "She's mine," Brenda said quickly. "Her name's Tuesday." Tuesday. Grandma Rose's mouth twisted. What kind of name is that for a baby girl? She's not a boy. I didn't have a boy's name ready. I was too young to speak, too young to move, too young to do anything but stare up at Grandma Rose with my big, blurry eyes. But I felt the warmth of her arms around me, and I knew she would save me. She always had. "This one's not right," Grandma Rose said, shaking her head. "She's too small. Too pale. You been feeding her at all?" "I've been trying." "You haven't been trying hard enough." Grandma Rose turned and walked out of the cabin, carrying me with her. I heard Brenda sputtering behind us, but she didn't try to stop her. And that was how I became Grandma Rose's baby. She fed me with a spoon, drop by drop, until I was strong enough to suckle from a bottle. She walked 3 miles every morning to get fresh goat's milk from a neighbor. She talked to me constantly, telling me stories about the family, about the farm, about the people who would be my world. "You're going to be a strong one," she said, wiping a drop of milk from my chin. "I can tell. Got that look in your eye." I didn't know what that look was. But I knew I wanted to deserve it. The years passed. I grew from a baby to a toddler to a little girl with tangled hair and bare feet and a smile that made Grandma Rose laugh. I learned the rhythm of the farm, the chickens clucking, the pigs grunting, the sound of my cousins racing through the yard. Daniel was the oldest. He was loud and restless and always hungry. He was also the one who noticed when Grandma Rose slipped me extra eggs. "Gram," he complained one morning, watching me eat a boiled egg that had been meant for someone else, "you spoil her." "She's the baby," Grandma Rose said, not looking up from the stove. "Babies get spoiled. I'm a baby too. You're 10 years old. And you've got hands. Go find your own food." Daniel grumbled, but he didn't argue. Nobody argued with Grandma Rose. She was the head of the family, the one who made the rules, the one who had the last word. And I was her favorite. It wasn't something I asked for. It wasn't something I expected. But I knew it was true. Grandma Rose looked at me differently than she looked at the others. She saw something in me that she didn't see in them. She saw me. I was 5 when Brenda tried to turn Daniel against me. She'd been watching me eat another egg, Grandma Rose's doing, of course, and her face had twisted with something that looked like jealousy. "Daniel," she said, sidling up to him in the yard, "don't you think it's unfair? You're the boy. The one who's going to carry on the family name. And she gets all the good food." Daniel looked at her with an expression I knew well, the expression of someone who had heard exactly what she wanted him to hear. "You're right," he said, nodding slowly. "It is unfair." Brenda's eyes lit up. "So you'll do something about it?" "I'll do something about it," Daniel agreed. Then he turned and ran into the house, straight to the pantry where Brenda kept her stash of brown sugar. He found it, dug his fingers in, and came out with a handful. "Thanks, Aunt Brenda," he called over his shoulder. "This is really nice of you." Brenda's face went white. That's not what I meant." But Daniel was already gone, running to the field where his father was working. I watched from behind the fence, a grin spreading across my face. Grandma Rose appeared at my side, her hand on my shoulder. "What's so funny?" "Nothing," I said. "Just Daniel being Daniel." She followed my gaze to where Daniel was now showing off his prize. Then she looked at Brenda, who was still standing in the yard, her mouth open in shock. "Daniel's a good boy," Grandma Rose said. "Always has been. Takes after his grandmother." She winked at me, and I laughed. We didn't have much. The farm was small, the house was old, and the winters were brutal. We didn't always have enough to eat, and sometimes I went to bed hungry. But Grandma Rose did everything she could to keep me fed, keep me warm, keep me safe. I found out later that she'd been saving her own food to give me. She'd been going without so I could have more. When I asked her why, she just said, "You're my girl. That's why." The Sterlings arrived in the winter. I was 7 years old. I'd been waiting for them, counting the days, knowing they were coming. In my first life, they'd shown up around the same time, pale and thin and barely holding themselves together. This time, they were worse. I saw them from the window of our house, stumbling down the muddy road. Mr. Sterling was leading the group, his eyes fixed on some point in the distance. Mrs. Sterling followed, her face gaunt, her clothes hanging loose on her thin frame. Ethan was behind her, looking like he hadn't eaten in weeks. And Lily was at the back of the group, her dark hair tangled, her cheeks hollow. She looked like a ghost. I felt something twist in my chest. I should have felt sympathy. I should have felt pity. But all I could think about was the fire. The smoke. The way she'd watched me die. She hadn't saved me then. She wouldn't save me now. "Don't stare," Grandma Rose said, pulling me away from the window. "It's not polite." I nodded and let her guide me away. But I couldn't stop thinking about the Sterlings. Couldn't stop planning. Couldn't stop waiting for the moment when everything would change again. The children in town had a new game. They called it Chase the Dog. Lily was the dog. Doggy, doggy, they taunted, throwing rocks at her. Bark for us. I watched from behind a tree. Lily was on the ground, her arms wrapped around her head, trying to protect herself. The other children circled her like wolves. I could have stopped them. I could have stepped in, told them to leave her alone. But I didn't. Because I remembered what she'd done to me. The way she'd locked me in the shed, the way she'd laughed when I cried, the way she'd taken everything I had and claimed it as her own. And now she was getting what she deserved. I stayed behind the tree until the children grew bored and wandered away. Then I stepped out and looked down at Lily, who was still curled on the ground. Are you okay? I asked. She looked up at me, and I saw something flash across her face, surprise, then recognition, then hatred. Who are you? Nobody, I said. Just someone passing by. I walked away before she could say anything else. I was 9 when I understood why Grandma Rose was getting sick. She'd been hiding it from me, pretending to be fine, waving away my concern when I asked why she was tired all the time. But I'd seen the way she moved, the way she held her side when she thought I wasn't looking. I was 9, but I'd lived a whole life before this one. I recognized the signs. Grandma, I said one evening, sitting beside her on the porch, are you going to die? She looked at me for a long moment. Then she sighed. Everyone dies eventually. But you're not going to die yet. I hope not, she said, reaching over to take my hand. I've got things to do before I go. What things? She squeezed my hand. I'm going to make sure you're okay. That's my job. The fire came the day I turned 15. I remembered it from my first life, but I hadn't known the details. I hadn't known who was behind it. I'd only known the panic, the smoke, the heat, and the sound of my own heart pounding in my ears. Now I knew. I saw Lily set the match. I saw her smile as the flames began to climb the wall. I saw her walk out of the building, hand in hand with Ethan. They thought I was inside. They thought I was trapped. They didn't see me in the shadows, watching them. When the fire was out and the ash had settled, I stepped out of the darkness. Lily and Ethan were standing with the other survivors, pretending to be grateful for the rescue. They didn't see me until I was right in front of them. You, Lily said, her face going pale. You were supposed to be dead. I smiled. Sorry to disappoint. The thing about living a second life is that you get a second chance. And if you're smart, you take it. I walked away from Lily and Ethan without looking back. I had everything I needed, Grandma Rose's love, Daniel's loyalty, and a future that was mine for the taking. And I was never going to let them take it away from me again. I grew up wild and barefoot on that farm. By the time I was 8, I could catch a chicken with my bare hands, climb any tree in the yard, and tell you exactly which mushrooms would kill you and which ones were safe to eat. Grandma Rose said I had country smarts, which meant I knew how to survive without anyone's help. But I also knew things I shouldn't know. I knew the Sterlings were living in a run-down shack at the edge of town, trying to keep up appearances while their savings dwindled. I knew Lily had started school in town and was getting bullied by the other kids. I knew Ethan had taken to hiding in the woods, brooding and angry, like a wounded animal. I knew all of this because I made it my business to know. I listened. I watched. I waited. And I planned. Daniel was my partner in crime. He'd grown into a lanky teenager with a mouth that never stopped running and a heart that was bigger than his stomach. He'd always been protective of me, ever since Grandma Rose put me in his arms and said, "This is your sister now. Take care of her." He took care of me. He kept me out of trouble, and when I couldn't stay out of trouble, he helped me get out of it. "Don't you ever get tired of sneaking around?" he asked one afternoon, following me through the woods toward the Sterling's shack. "Nope. It's a 15-minute walk. You could just go the normal way. Where's the fun in that?" He shook his head but kept following. He always did. We reached the edge of the clearing and crouched behind a thicket of bushes. The Sterling's shack was small and run down, with a sagging roof and windows that had been patched with cardboard. A thin line of smoke rose from the chimney. "Look at them," I said softly. "Look at how they live." Daniel peered through the branches. "They don't look like much." "They're not supposed to. That's the point." Inside the shack, I could see Mrs. Sterling moving around, her movements slow and tired. She'd aged a lot in the past few years. The fall from grace had been hard on her. "She's sad," Daniel said. "I know. Why are you so interested in them?" I didn't answer. I couldn't tell him the truth, that I'd lived another life, that I'd been one of them, that I'd died because of them. That would have sounded crazy. So I just said, "They interest me." The confrontation came on a Sunday. I was walking home from the store with a sack of flour when Brenda stepped out from behind a tree, blocking my path. She'd gotten thinner over the years, her face lined with bitterness. She'd never forgiven herself for swapping the babies, not because she felt guilty, but because her plan hadn't worked out the way she'd hoped. Lily had grown up in a house that was falling apart, and Iris had gotten all the love and attention. She blamed me for that. "Tuesday," she said, her voice tight. "We need to talk." I didn't stop. "I'm busy." "It'll only take a minute." I kept walking. She fell into step beside me, her eyes burning with resentment. "You think you're so special," she said. "You think you're better than everyone else just because the old lady spoils you." "Grandma doesn't spoil me. She treats me like family." "You're not family." I stopped walking. "Excuse me." "You heard me." Brenda stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You're not one of us. You were never one of us. I'm not even your real mother." I felt my heart speed up, but I kept my face calm. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. "What are you talking about?" I asked, making my voice sound small and confused. Brenda smiled. It was an ugly smile, full of malice. "I found you. You were a baby, abandoned on the side of the road. I took you in because I felt sorry for you. But you were never mine." That was a lie. She'd stolen me. She'd swapped me for her own daughter. "I don't believe you," I said. "Believe what you want. But I think you know the truth. You've always been too smart for your own good." She leaned in, her voice dropping even lower. "Your real family, the people you came from, they're the ones in the shack at the end of the road." I let my face go pale. "The Sterlings?" "That's right. Your real mother, your real father, your real brother. And your real sister, the one who got the life you were supposed to have. Lily." I felt a thrill of satisfaction. She had no idea that I already knew. She thought she was blowing up my world, destroying everything I thought I knew. She thought she was winning. But I was the one who had been waiting for this moment. "You're lying," I said, making my voice crack. "You're just jealous because I'm happy." Brenda laughed. "Believe what you want. But now you know." She turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the middle of the road with a bag of flour in my arms and a smile hidden behind my fear. I told Grandma Rose that night. We were sitting in her room, the same room where she'd kept me warm and fed for all those years. She was mending a shirt, her needle moving quickly in the lamplight. "Brenda came to see me today," I said. Grandma Rose didn't look up. "What did she want?" "She told me I wasn't hers. She told me the Sterlings were my real family." The needle stopped moving. "I see," Grandma Rose said slowly. "And what did you tell her?" "I told her she was lying." "Good girl." She set down the shirt and reached over to take my hand. "Brenda's a bitter woman. She's unhappy with the choices she made, and she wants to make everyone else unhappy too. But you're my granddaughter. You always have been. And that's not going to change." I squeezed her hand. "I know, Grandma." "Good." She went back to mending the shirt. "Now, are you going to tell me what you're planning to do about the Sterlings?" I blinked. "What?" She looked up, a knowing gleam in her eye. "Don't play dumb with me, child. I know you better than anyone. You're not the type to let things lie. You're going to do something about the Sterlings, aren't you? I opened my mouth to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. She'd seen right through me. I don't know what I'm going to do yet, I admitted. But I'm not going to let them ignore me. They owe me something. They don't owe you anything. They're strangers. They're not strangers, Grandma. They're the people who let me go. She studied me for a long moment. Then she sighed and shook her head. You're going to do whatever you're going to do, she said. I can see that. Just promise me one thing. What? Don't let them change you. You're my granddaughter, and I'm proud of the person you've become. Don't let them take that away. I promised her I wouldn't. The conversation with Brenda had confirmed what I already suspected. She was going to try to use the Sterlings against me, to make me feel like I didn't belong, to make me feel like an outsider. But I'd already been an outsider. I'd already been the unwanted one, the one who didn't fit in. And I'd survived. I'd survive this too. The next day, I went to the Sterlings' shack. I didn't knock. I just walked up to the door and pushed it open. The room was small and dark, the only light coming from a smoky oil lamp in the corner. Mrs. Sterling was sitting at a rickety table, mending a shirt. She looked up when I entered, her eyes widening in surprise. Tuesday, she said. I'm not going to call you Mom, I said. And I'm not going to pretend we're family. But I'm here because I need something. Mrs. Sterling set down her mending. What do you need? Information. About what happened. About why I was given away. She was quiet for a long moment. You weren't given away. You were stolen. By Brenda. Yes. She swapped you for her own daughter, Lily. She wanted Lily to have a better life. Did you know? No. I didn't find out until recently. Mrs. Sterling's voice was bitter. If I'd known, I would have done something. I didn't believe her. She'd known. She'd known in my first life, and she'd done nothing. But I didn't say that. Instead, I said, I want to know more. About who I was supposed to be. Mrs. Sterling nodded slowly. I can tell you. But I need something in return. What? Your forgiveness. I stared at her. You want me to forgive you? I want you to give me a chance. She leaned forward, her eyes pleading. I know I failed you. I know I wasn't there for you. But I want to make it right. I didn't answer. I just turned and walked out the door. I didn't go straight home. Instead, I went to Lily. She was in the woods, hiding from the other children. She looked up when she heard me coming, her face hardening. What do you want? To talk. About what? About who you really are. Lily's face flickered. I know who I am. You're the girl who was supposed to be in my place. The girl who was supposed to be a Sterling. I am a Sterling. No, you're not. I stepped closer, my voice soft. I'm the real Iris Sterling. And you're just a placeholder. Lily's face went white. That's a lie. You know it's not. She stared at me, her eyes wide with fear. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. When everything comes crashing down, I said, when the Sterlings realize what you really are, you'll be nothing. You'll have nowhere to go. And no one to turn to. I'll never be nothing. Everyone is nothing in the end. I turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the woods. Behind me, I heard her breathing quicken, heard the first sob escape her lips. Good. She'd done the same to me, in another life. She'd stood by and watched me burn. She'd let her brother choose her over me. Now she knew what it felt like to be the one left behind. The news spread through town like wildfire. The Sterlings were leaving. I heard it from Daniel first. He came bursting into the house, his face flushed with excitement. They're going back, he said. The Sterlings, they got their name cleared. Someone in the government signed a paper saying they were wrongfully accused. They're packing up right now. I felt a jolt run through me, sharp and electric. I knew this was coming. I'd known for years. But hearing it out loud made it real. When? I asked. Tomorrow, I think. Maybe the day after. They're not wasting any time. I went to my room and sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the wall. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. The moment when everything would change. But I didn't feel ready. I thought about Grandma Rose. About the years she'd spent raising me, feeding me, protecting me. About the way she'd held me when I cried and scolded me when I was wrong. About the life we'd built together, the life that was about to be broken apart. And I thought about the Sterlings. About the money they'd have now, the power they'd have, the world they'd open up to me if I chose to go with them. I didn't know which choice was right. Grandma Rose found me in my room that evening. She didn't knock. She just pushed the door open and walked in, her old joints creaking with every step. I heard about the Sterlings, she said. I know. You've been thinking about it. I nodded. What are you going to do? I don't know yet. She sat down on the bed beside me, her hand reaching out to pat my knee. I know you've got a lot of thinking to do. And I know you're worried about me. I'm always worried about you. I know. That's why I'm telling you this, don't be. She squeezed my knee. I'm not gonna live forever. And I don't want you to spend your whole life in this place because you're afraid of leaving me behind. Grandma. I mean it. Her voice was sharp, but her eyes were soft. You've got a chance to do something with your life. Something big. And I'm not going to let you throw that away because you're worried about an old woman who's already lived her life. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. Now, she said, standing up, you go to those Sterlings. You take what they're offering. And you make a life for yourself. And you. I'll be right here. Waiting for you to visit. She hobbled toward the door, then stopped and turned back. Besides, she said, a sly grin spreading across her face, if you marry someone rich, you can buy me a fancy new wheelchair. I laughed, and for a moment, the weight in my chest lifted. I visited the Sterlings the next morning. They were in their shack, surrounded by boxes, the bustle of departure filling the small space. Mr. Sterling was on the porch, directing a group of men who were loading their belongings onto a truck. Mrs. Sterling was inside, supervising the packing, and Lily was in the corner, watching it all with a hollow look in her eyes. She'd been completely forgotten in the chaos. Tuesday, Mrs. Sterling said when she saw me. I was hoping you'd come. I need to talk to you. Of course. She waved me into the room, closing the door behind us. What is it? I've decided, I said. I'm going with you. Her face lit up. You are? Oh, that's wonderful. But I have conditions. Her smile dimmed. Conditions? I'm bringing Grandma Rose. She's going to live with me. In the city. In a place I provide for her. Mrs. Sterling blinked. I'm not sure that's possible. Our house isn't very big. I'll buy my own house. Or rent one. It doesn't matter. The point is, she comes with me. I'm not leaving her behind. Mrs. Sterling looked like she wanted to argue. But something in my expression must have warned her not to. Fine, she said finally. If that's what you need. It is. Ethan was waiting for me when I walked out. He'd grown up over the years, tall and lean, with the same dark hair and sharp eyes I remembered from my first life. He looked older than his age, hardened by the years of struggle. You're coming with us, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. Why? I met his gaze. Because I want to. You could stay here. With your real family. I shook my head. This is where I need to be. You're not like them, you know. The Sterlings. You're not like any of us. I know. He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something flicker across his face. Respect, maybe. Or just curiosity. All right, he said. Welcome to the family. The day of our departure came faster than I expected. Grandma Rose packed her things into a single small bag. She didn't have much. She never had. You sure about this? She asked as I helped her into the car. I've never been more sure of anything. You're going to be okay. You know that, right? Grandma. I raised you right. She reached out and took my hand. I taught you everything I know. And you turned out better than I could have hoped. I'm proud of you. I blinked back tears. I'm proud of you too. She squeezed my hand. Then let's get out of this town. The journey was long, the roads rough, the car cramped. I spent most of the ride watching the landscape change. The hills gave way to flat land, the farms to houses, the houses to buildings that got taller and taller. By the time we reached the city, I felt like I'd entered a different world. The Sterling mansion was exactly as I remembered. Grand, imposing, and cold. The kind of house that impressed visitors and intimidated everyone else. This is the place, Mrs. Sterling said as we pulled into the driveway. I didn't say anything. I just took Grandma Rose's hand and helped her out of the car. Don't worry, I whispered. We'll get our own place soon. I'm not worried, she said. I've got you. The next few months were a blur of adjustments. School, social events, the constant pressure to be someone I wasn't. The Sterlings were kind, in their way, but they didn't understand me. They didn't understand where I'd come from, what I'd been through, who I really was. Lily was there too, hovering at the edges of everything, never quite fitting in. She'd come to the city with us, but she had no place in this world. She was a reminder of everything the Sterlings wanted to forget. Ethan was the only one who treated me like I belonged. He didn't ask questions. He didn't judge. He just accepted me as I was. Welcome to the family, he'd said. And somehow, he meant it. I found a small apartment for Grandma Rose a few blocks away from the Sterling mansion. It wasn't much, just a single room with a kitchenette and a bed, but it was hers. And it was close enough that I could visit her every day. She settled in quickly, making friends with the neighbors and learning to navigate the city. She was tougher than anyone gave her credit for. I've survived harder things, she said when I asked how she was doing. I'm not going to let a few buildings get the best of me. I laughed, and for a moment, everything felt right. The turning point came on a cold winter evening. I was at the Sterling mansion, sitting in the library, when Ethan walked in. He was pale, his face tight with tension. What's wrong? I asked. Nothing. Everything. I don't know. Try again. He dropped into the chair across from me and ran a hand through his hair. Lily's been talking. Spreading rumors about you. About who you really are. I felt my heart stop. What kind of rumors? The kind that could get you in trouble. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. She's been telling people you're not really a Sterling. That you're a fraud. That you only got in because you manipulated your way in. She's lying. I know. But people believe her. I had known she'd try something. She'd never been able to accept that I'd taken her place, that she'd lost the one thing she'd always had, her position as the favorite. Let her talk, I said. The truth will come out eventually. You're not worried. I'm not afraid of Lily. Later that night, I found Lily in the garden. She was sitting on a stone bench, her hands folded in her lap, looking like a ghost in the moonlight. Lily, I said. We need to talk. She looked up at me, her expression guarded. What about? About you. Me. You've been telling people I'm not a real Sterling. She didn't deny it. She just shrugged. It's the truth. I walked over and sat down beside her. Why are you doing this? Because you're not supposed to be here. Her voice was sharp and bitter. You're not supposed to be part of this family. I'm supposed to be the one in your place. I'm supposed to be the one with the future. You could have had it, I said. If you hadn't thrown it away. What are you talking about? I know what you did, I said. I know about the fire. I know about the rumors. I know everything. Lily's face went pale. How do you? I know more than you think. I saw her hand twitch toward her pocket. I didn't move. Lily, I said quietly, if you make a move against me, you'll lose everything. And I mean everything. You won't just be kicked out of this family. You'll be the person who destroyed herself. She sat there, frozen. The silence stretched between us, heavy and thick. Then she dropped her hand. You win, she whispered. For now. I nodded and left her alone in the garden. I wasn't worried about what she'd do next. I was ready. I spent the first year in the city watching and learning. The Sterlings had money again, not as much as before, but enough to open doors. They threw parties, attended galas, and slowly clawed their way back into the circles they'd once belonged to. Mrs. Sterling was relentless in her social climbing. Mr. Sterling focused on rebuilding the family business. And Ethan? Ethan was the golden boy. The heir. The one everyone wanted to get close to. Lily attached herself to him like a barnacle. She was at his side at every event, laughing at his jokes, touching his arm, playing the devoted sister. In public, she was perfect. In private, she was desperate. She knew she was losing her grip on the family. She knew Mrs. Sterling had never forgiven her for the betrayal that had nearly destroyed them. She knew Mr. Sterling saw her as a liability. Ethan was her only anchor. And she was clinging to him for dear life. I saw it all unfold from the edges. I wasn't invited to the parties. I wasn't part of the family's public image. I was the country cousin, the awkward reminder of their fall from grace. Mrs. Sterling loved me in private. She gave me gifts, visited Grandma Rose, and called me my dear daughter, but in public, I was invisible. That suited me fine. Invisibility was an advantage. People said things in front of me they never would have said if they thought I mattered. You know, one of Mrs. Sterling's friends said at a gathering I'd been invited to, "Your husband looks so tired these days. All that work rebuilding his company must be exhausting." "He's fine," Mrs. Sterling said, her smile tight. "He's a fighter." "That's good. Because I heard the Andersons are trying to poach his best clients. You'd think they'd have more loyalty after everything your family went through. People forget loyalty when there's money involved." I filed that information away. The Andersons. Poaching clients. Useful to know. Lily found me in the garden after that conversation. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "You don't belong at these events." "Neither do you." Her face flushed with anger. "I'm a Sterling." "You're a pretender. And everyone knows it." I walked away before she could respond. The tipping point came 6 months later. Grandma Rose had been struggling with her health for years. The city wasn't good for her. Too much noise, too much pollution, too much stress. But she refused to move back to the country. "I'm not leaving you," she said when I tried to talk her into it. "I came here to stay." "You'll die if you stay here." "Then I'll die with you." I couldn't argue with that. I started spending more time at her apartment, cooking for her, taking her to doctor's appointments, trying to keep her comfortable. She was a tough old bird, but even tough birds got tired eventually. "You need to stop worrying about me," she said one evening as I helped her into bed. "You've got your own life to live. My life is here. With you." "No." She reached out and took my hand. "Your life is with them. The Sterlings. They're your family, whether you like it or not. And they're going to need you." "They don't need me. They barely notice I exist." "Not yet." Her grip tightened. "But they will." I didn't believe her. But I didn't argue. I just tucked her in and kissed her forehead. Ethan and Lily's engagement was announced 6 months later. I heard the news from Daniel, who'd come to visit me for the weekend. He'd learned to navigate the city with surprising ease, making friends and connections that would serve him well in the years to come. "They're getting married?" I asked, incredulous. Did Mrs. Sterling approve? From what I heard, she had no choice. Lily got pregnant. I felt my blood run cold. "She's pregnant?" "Yep. And Ethan's the father. Or so she says." I sat down heavily in a chair. This wasn't supposed to happen. In my first life, Lily and Ethan had been the ones who destroyed me. They'd been together, happy, while I burned. But this time, it was different. This time, I was the one who'd been watching and waiting. This time, I was ready. Daniel, I said, I need you to do something for me. What? I need you to find out if there's anyone else who's been courting Lily. Anyone at all. Daniel raised an eyebrow but didn't question me. I'll see what I can find out. He came back with news a few weeks later. There's a man, he said. A businessman from out of town. He's been seen with Lily a few times. Nothing scandalous, just dinners, coffee. But she's been meeting him secretly. Who is he? His name's Marcus. He runs a small investment firm. He's not wealthy, but he's got connections. The kind of connections that could be useful to someone who's trying to escape a bad situation. I smiled. Perfect. What are you planning? Nothing yet. But keep watching. Let me know if anything changes. Daniel nodded and disappeared back into the city. Lily came to see me a few days later. She was pale, her eyes red-rimmed, her usual confidence replaced by something that looked like fear. She didn't bother with pleasantries. She just sat down across from me and said, I know you've been watching me. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me. Her voice cracked. I know you've been following me. I know you've been talking to people. What do you want? I met her gaze. I want you to suffer. She flinched. Why? What did I ever do to you? You know exactly what you did. I don't. Lily. I leaned forward, my voice dropping. I know about the fire. I know about the rumors. I know everything you've done to me, in this life and the one before. Her face went pale. You can't prove any of that. I don't need to prove it. I just need to make sure everyone else knows. She stared at me, her eyes wide with fear. Whatever you're planning, she said, it won't work. I'll find a way to stop you. Good luck with that. Ethan found me in the garden the next day. I know you've been threatening Lily, he said. I didn't deny it. What she did was wrong. What she did? She was just trying to survive. By destroying me. She didn't destroy you. You're still here. I laughed. Is that what she told you? That she didn't destroy me? She told me everything. About her life, about her struggles. She's not a bad person, Iris. She's just desperate. And that makes it okay. No. He shook his head. It doesn't make it okay. But it makes it understandable. I didn't say anything. I didn't know what to say. Just think about it, he said. Think about what she's been through. And think about what you're doing. I watched him walk away, and I felt something twist in my chest. He still didn't understand. He still didn't see what she was capable of. Grandma Rose died 2 weeks later. She went peacefully, in her sleep, with me holding her hand. I woke up to find her cold, her face peaceful, her hand still wrapped around mine. I sat there for a long time, not moving, not crying. Just holding her hand. She was gone. The only person who had ever loved me unconditionally was gone. I was alone. The funeral was small. I didn't invite the Sterlings. I didn't want them there. Daniel came. He sat beside me and held my hand, his silent presence a comfort I didn't know I needed. She was a good woman, he said. She was the best. She raised you right. I nodded. I know. After the funeral, I went back to my apartment and sat in the dark. I thought about everything Grandma Rose had done for me. The egg she'd saved for me every morning. The stories she'd told me at night. The way she'd held me when I cried and scolded me when I was wrong. She'd been my mother, my father, my everything. And now she was gone. I felt the tears come, finally, hot and bitter and endless. I cried for her, for myself, for the life we'd built and the life we'd lost. When I finally stopped, I made a promise. I was going to win. Not for revenge, not for power. For her. Because she'd believed in me when no one else did. Because she'd given me everything she had. I was going to make her proud. I didn't cry for long. There wasn't time. Grandma Rose's funeral had cost me nearly everything I'd saved. The Sterlings offered to pay, but I refused. This was my debt to her. Mine alone. After she was buried, I sat on the porch of her empty apartment and made a list. Not of what I'd lost, that would have filled pages. A list of what I still had. My name. My face. My brain. And the knowledge of a future that hadn't happened yet. I knew which companies would fail. Which stocks would soar. Which deals would make people rich and which would destroy them. I'd lived through the next 15 years once already, and I'd paid attention. Now it was time to use what I'd learned. I started small. I took the money Mrs. Sterling had given me over the years, bits and pieces, tucked away in a savings account, and I invested it in a small tech startup that I knew would explode. The founders were young, hungry, and brilliant. They just needed a little capital to get started. I gave them what I had and asked for a small percentage in return. They were skeptical at first, a 19-year-old girl with no business experience. But I knew things. I told them exactly which markets to target, which investors to avoid, which competitors would fail within the year. They listened. They won. And I got my first taste of real money. The Sterlings noticed, of course. Mrs. Sterling called me into her sitting room one evening, her face a careful mask of concern. "I heard you've been making investments," she said. "I have. Is it true you bought into that tech company?" "Yes." "And that you've already made a profit?" "A small one." She studied me for a long moment. "You're very clever, aren't you?" "I'm just paying attention." Mrs. Sterling didn't say anything else. She just nodded and let me go. But I could feel her eyes on my back as I left the room, assessing, calculating. She was trying to figure out if I was a threat or an asset.
I let her wonder.
Ethan came to see me a few weeks later. He looked tired, his face thinner than I remembered, dark circles under his eyes. Lily's pregnancy was taking a toll on him, not from joy, but from stress. He didn't want to be a father. He didn't want to be trapped. "You should be happy," I said when he sat down across from me. "You're going to have a child." He didn't answer. "Ethan." "I'm not happy." He rubbed his eyes. "I don't love her anymore. Maybe I never did." "Then why are you staying?" "Because I have no choice. She's having my child. My parents are expecting me to do the right thing." "Since when have you cared about doing the right thing?" He looked up at me, and I saw something in his eyes that I'd never seen before. Doubt. Regret. The beginning of understanding. "I don't know," he said. "I don't know anything anymore." He left soon after, and I didn't try to stop him. There was nothing I could say that would make a difference. He had to figure it out on his own. Lily gave birth to a baby girl on a cold December morning. Mrs. Sterling told me the news as if it were a death. "She's healthy, thank God. But she has Lily's coloring. There's no way to pretend she's anyone else's." "Why would you want to pretend?" She didn't answer. She just looked at me with that same assessing expression. I understood then. She'd been hoping the child would look like Ethan, would be proof that Lily was finally part of the family. But a daughter who looked like her mother was a reminder of everything they'd been trying to forget. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. I visited Lily in the hospital. She looked exhausted, her hair greasy, her face pale. The baby was sleeping in a bassinet beside her, a tiny bundle of pink blankets. "What do you want?" she asked when she saw me. "To offer my congratulations." "Bullshit. You're here to gloat." I walked over to the bassinet and looked down at the baby. She was small and perfect, with a dusting of dark hair on her head. "She's beautiful," I said. "She's nothing." Lily's voice was sharp. "She's a girl. She's not what they wanted. She's your daughter. She's a tool. And I'm going to use her." I looked at her for a long moment. She wasn't a monster. She was just desperate. Desperate to hold on to something, anything, that would keep her in the family. "You could have had a different life," I said. "You could have been happy." "I'm happy." "No, you're not. You've never been happy." She didn't have an answer for that. The baby was named Sophia. Mrs. Sterling barely looked at her, too focused on her next social event, her next business opportunity. Mr. Sterling was polite but distant, treating his granddaughter like a stranger. Ethan was the only one who seemed to care, holding her awkwardly, talking to her in a soft voice. Lily watched him, her eyes hungry and hopeful. She thought the baby would bring them closer. I knew better. I stayed in the background during those years. I built my company quietly, hiring people who were loyal and discreet. I avoided the Sterling social circle, attending only the events that mattered. I made money, invested it wisely, and waited. By the time I was 25, I was worth more than the Sterlings would ever be again. And they had no idea. The confrontation came at a family dinner. Lily had been drinking heavily all evening, her eyes glassy, her words slurred. Ethan was trying to ignore her, talking to his father about business. Mrs. Sterling was pretending everything was normal. I was watching it all from my seat at the corner of the table. Everyone's been so nice to me, Lily said suddenly, her voice cutting through the noise. Ever since I gave you a grandchild. Mrs. Sterling's smile froze. We're always nice to you, dear. No, you're not. You've never been nice to me. You've been waiting for me to fail. You've been waiting for me to mess up. Lily. I know what you think of me. I know what everyone thinks of me. She stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. But I'm still here. I'm still a Sterling. And nothing you do will change that. The table was silent. Lily, Ethan said quietly, maybe you should sit down. No, I don't want to sit down. She turned to me, her eyes blazing with anger. You think you've won, don't you? You think you're so much better than me. But you're nothing. You've always been nothing. I'm not the one who's been clinging to this family like a life raft, I said calmly. What did you say? You heard me. You've been desperate to be accepted, to be loved. And it's never going to happen. I stood up, my voice even. You'll always be the outsider. The one who doesn't belong. Lily stared at me, her face pale with shock. Then she ran out of the room. I followed her. She was in the garden, crying against a stone bench. I don't understand why you hate me so much, she said when I sat down beside her. I don't hate you. I just don't care about you. Why not? We're supposed to be sisters. We're not sisters. We never were. She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. I know I'm not a real Sterling. I've always known. But I thought maybe, if I tried hard enough. You did try. You tried too hard. And everyone could see it. She didn't say anything. She just sat there, tears streaming down her face. I know you've been planning to leave, I said. I know you've been in contact with Marcus. Her head snapped up. How do you know that? Because I make it my business to know things. I'm not going anywhere. You should. You should leave this place, this life. Start over somewhere else. Before they destroy you completely. Why do you care? I don't. I stood up. I'm just telling you what's going to happen. Whether you listen is up to you. I left her alone in the garden. A month later, Lily was gone. She left a note for Ethan, a letter for the Sterlings, and a stack of lies for anyone who would listen. She said she was going to find herself. She said she needed to escape. She said she'd send for Sophia when she was ready. No one heard from her again. Ethan was devastated, though he tried to hide it. He'd spent years trying to save her, and he'd failed. It broke him in ways he couldn't express. I found him in the garden the night she left, standing in the same spot where she'd cried. She's gone, he said. I know. She took everything. Not everything. She left Sophia. He looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes. Grief, yes. But also relief. And behind that, shame. Thank you, he said. For what? For not telling me. For letting her go. I nodded. You're welcome. I took over the Sterling's company after that. Not through force, not through manipulation. They came to me, asking for help. Their business was failing, their reputation in ruins. They needed someone who could save them. I did. But on my terms. I'll take over the company, I said. I'll rebuild it. I'll make it profitable again. But I want full control. Mr. Sterling hesitated. You want to run the company? I want to own the company. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. You want to buy us out, Mrs. Sterling said slowly. No. I want you to give it to me. That's not. That's the offer. Take it or leave it. They took it. I ran the Sterling's company for 10 years. I turned it around, made it profitable, expanded it into new markets. I became one of the most respected business leaders in the city. I never married. I never had children. I never needed anyone. But I was never alone. Daniel was with me every step of the way, my partner in crime and my closest friend. Sophia grew up in my care, bright and kind and nothing like her mother. And Grandma Rose watched from wherever she was, proud of the woman I'd become. The last time I saw Lily was at the airport. I was leaving the city for a business trip when I spotted her in the terminal. She looked older, thinner, her face marked by years of struggle. But her eyes were clear. She saw me at the same moment I saw her. We walked toward each other, stopping a few feet apart. I heard you're doing well, she said. I am. Sophia. She's wonderful. She's smart, kind, and nothing like you. I paused. She misses you. Lily's face crumbled. I don't deserve her. Probably not. But she deserves you. I watched her walk away, disappearing into the crowd. I didn't feel anger or resentment. I didn't feel anything except a quiet satisfaction. I'd won. I'd finally, truly won. And the person I'd been fighting for all this time, the girl who'd died in that fire, the girl who'd been forgotten, was finally at peace. I never saw Lily again after that day at the airport. Not in person, anyway. I heard things sometimes, rumors, whispers, the kind of news that travels through the grapevine and gets distorted along the way. Someone said she'd moved west, married a farmer, had more children. Someone else said she'd gone abroad, reinvented herself, become someone entirely new. I never tried to find out the truth. I didn't need to. Whatever life she'd built for herself, wherever she'd ended up, it was hers now. The past was behind us both. Sophia grew up in my care. She was a bright girl, sharp and curious, with a stubborn streak that reminded me of someone I used to know. Me, maybe. Or maybe just herself. I never hid the truth from her. I told her about Lily, about the Sterlings, about the complicated web of families and secrets that had brought her into this world. She listened, asked questions, and formed her own opinions. You could have hated her, she said once, sitting at the kitchen table, doing her homework. My mother. You could have hated her for everything she did. I did hate her, I said. For a long time. What changed? I thought about it. I realized that hating her was like holding onto a hot coal. It was only burning me. Sophia nodded, seemingly satisfied with that answer. She was wise beyond her years. I supposed she'd had to be. I didn't stay in the city forever. After the Sterling's company was stable, I sold it. Not to them, they'd lost the right to reclaim it long ago. I sold it to a group of investors who'd been courting me for years, people who saw the potential in what I'd built. I took the money and moved. Not back to the country. Too many memories there. Not to another city. Too many people. I bought a small house on the coast, a place with a view of the ocean and a garden full of wildflowers. I wasn't lonely. I'd never been lonely. But I was finally, truly content. Daniel visited often. He'd built a life of his own, a successful one, with a wife and children and a house that was always full of laughter. He'd never forgotten where he came from, the farm, the family, the grandmother who'd raised us both. Remember when she used to make us sit on the porch and shell peas? He asked one evening, sitting beside me on the deck. I laughed. I remember. She'd get mad if we ate more than we shelled. We were always eating more than we shelled. She was always getting mad. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sunset. The sky was pink and gold, the ocean calm. She'd be proud of you, Daniel said. Grandma. She'd be so proud. I hope so. I know so. She always said you were special. From the very first day she brought you home. I felt a lump form in my throat. I miss her. Me too. I visited the old farm once, years later. It was a mistake, maybe. Too many ghosts. But I needed to see it, to say goodbye properly. The house was still standing, but it had been renovated, modernized, stripped of its old character. The field where we'd played was gone, replaced by a housing development. The only thing that remained was the oak tree in the yard, the one where Grandma Rose had hung the tire swing. I stood under it for a long time, remembering. The sound of her voice. The way her hands felt when she held me. The smell of her cooking, the warmth of her embrace. I didn't cry. I was past crying. But I felt a deep, quiet gratitude for the time we'd had. She'd saved me. Not just from Brenda, not just from the Sterlings. She'd saved me from becoming someone I didn't want to be. Ethan found me years later, at a conference in another city. I'd heard he'd remarried, had more children, built a life that had nothing to do with the Sterlings or the past. He looked older, but happier, the lines on his face softer than they'd been when he was young. Iris, he said, approaching me in the lobby. I was hoping I'd find you here. Ethan. I wasn't sure how to feel. How are you? Better. Much better. He smiled, and it was genuine. I wanted to thank you. For what? For not giving up on me. For being patient when I didn't deserve it. I shook my head. You don't need to thank me. Yes, I do. He stepped closer. I was lost after Lily left. I didn't know who I was, what I wanted. But you showed me that I could be different. That I could do better. You did that yourself. Maybe. But you helped. We talked for a while after that, about our lives, our work, the people we'd become. It was strange, talking to him like this, without the weight of the past pressing down on us. But it was good, too. A kind of closure I hadn't known I needed. Before he left, he said something that stayed with me. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if things had been different. If Lily had never switched us. If you'd grown up as a Sterling. If I'd been the brother you deserved. That's not how it happened, I said. I know. But I'm glad it happened this way. Why? He paused. Because if it hadn't, I never would have known what it was like to have a sister who saved me. And I wouldn't have known what it was like to find my own way. I watched him walk away, and I felt something shift inside me. Something that had been broken for a long time, finally beginning to heal. Sophia grew up and moved away. She went to college, got a job, fell in love. She came to visit me sometimes, bringing her partner and her children. I watched her build the life I'd never had, and I felt nothing but joy. You're happy, I said one afternoon, sitting on the deck with her. Finally, she said. I think I am. Good. You deserve it. So do you, Aunt Iris. I smiled. I know. The last time I thought about the fire, I wasn't angry. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when the memory came to me. Not the fear, not the pain, just the memory. The smell of smoke, the heat on my skin, the sound of my own heartbeat. I didn't feel afraid. I didn't feel angry. I just felt grateful. Grateful that I'd survived. Grateful that I'd found my way. Grateful that I'd had people who loved me. Grandma Rose. Daniel. Sophia. Even Ethan, in his own complicated way. I opened my eyes and looked at the window. The moon was full, the stars bright. The ocean was calm and quiet. I had everything I needed. Everything I'd ever wanted. And I was finally, truly, completely at peace. They say you can't go back. That the past is past, and all you can do is move forward. Maybe that's true. But sometimes, the past is what shapes you. Sometimes, the things you've been through are the things that make you strong. I'd been through a lot. I'd been stolen, ignored, used, and discarded. I'd been betrayed by people who were supposed to love me. I'd lost people who meant everything to me. But I'd survived. I'd built something from nothing. I'd found a family in the strangest places. And I'd learned that the most important thing isn't getting revenge, isn't proving them wrong, isn't winning. It's finding your own way. It's building your own life. It's becoming the person you were always meant to be. I'd done all of that. And now, finally, I could rest. I closed my eyes and let the darkness take me. It wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something new.